Today, we're going to talk about Arive's Automation Rules tab in Company Settings. Let's get started. All right, the Arive Automations Rule tab is where you create, edit, and manage all of the automation rules that run in your Arive organization. By default, you're going to see that it lists out all active and or inactive automation rules that currently exist in your org. Now, thankfully, they've given you many filters and features to find the ones that specifically apply. But let's talk about it and talk about some of the gotchas that currently exist. You're going to see on my example page here, I'm using the search bar, which is the first best way to find the automation you're looking for. That's going to search the name of the automation and it will search in the description. However, it does not search inside the actions that are taken. This is an important caveat. If you're going to search for something about the message that a notification sends or something about a custom field that is referenced, I recommend actually using Control F and using the browser search to look through it, as opposed to using the built-in search, which filters the remaining results displayed. That being said, you're going to see up in the top left-hand corner, there's a drop-down for triggers and actions. This lets you filter by automation rules that contain that trigger you specified or that action you specified. Great when you're trying to troubleshoot something that's firing at a very specific loan status or when a certain action is taken. Next up, above that's a little checkbox that says Include Inactive. This is not necessarily checked by default, but I like to keep it on because I want to see all the rules that exist in my org, even if they're not currently turned on. And that is something nice to keep in mind when rolling out new rules. You can build them, test them, and turn them off until you're ready later to flip them back on. The sort by has a lot more options than you'd think. So the up and down arrow on the very right of it chooses ascending or descending. But you have a couple things to pick here. Rule identifier is that little ID that it's going to show on each individual automation record. That's assigned automatically, and it assigns it to the lowest value available of the current active IDs. Important caveat here: if you delete an automation and then later create one, it will try to use that same ID if it's the lowest ID spot available. So sometimes these sequences won't always show the latest created record up at the top because it sorts by default by the automation identifier, which can sometimes fill in gaps further down below where there were prior automations that later got deleted. You can also sort, though, by the name of the rule, the date it was created, or last updated. Last updated is great if something recently changed and you're trying to figure out what. Don't sleep on that automations log button in the top right-hand corner. This is a recent feature that's being added here and a lot of other places in Arive Admin Controls, and it is a lifesaver in trying to figure out who changed what when. That being said, you're going to notice two buttons on the right side of the top here next to that bar. There's Task Template, which is part of some of the new task features. This is where you're going to create tasks that can be created and fired by automations as well as elsewhere. Those templates live there. Next to it is the New Rule button, and that's where you're going to build rules. We're going to talk about rules first, and then we're going to come back later to the task templates. So on my screen, you see one example automation that is the result of my search. It has its title, a description which is partially concatenated, so it can be longer than that. If you hover over it, you'll notice a tooltip pops up to show the whole description. And then it's going to show the trigger criteria next to the purple lightning bolt, and then the actions taken, which is next to that green arrow. Keep in mind, these can get pretty complicated, and sometimes these values can be truncated. So the only way to really see all the details of it is to open it up. Now, great news, the default behavior of these rules is when you click on the rule, it opens a modal with that rule open, and it's already open in edit mode. But you have some other options that you can do with these. On the right-hand side of the individual automation rule, you'll notice a toggle next to active, and that's where you can flip the rule on and off without deleting it. The three dots on the very right-hand side give you options both to jump into edit mode as well as cloning the rule and deleting it. Cloning the rule can be very nice because there's a lot of times where you have an existing rule and you're just covering a slightly different edge case that you want to complete. Keep in mind, there's some best practices about writing rules, which I'll cover in another video later. But you don't necessarily want to build several rules that all have the same identical trigger criteria. And there are reasons for that, again, we'll talk about in a later video. But if you're going to edit or review the existing rule, you can either click on it or you can go to this right menu and click Edit. This is going to open it up, and you're going to see right up at the top is the full description and title. Clicking on either of those will open up a window that allows you to edit and update those. You'll have your initial trigger criteria. Now, we have a fairly long list of things we can pick that initially kick off this rule. Keep in mind, it's not only these things that are happening. We're going to talk about additional rule criteria in just a sec. But not getting into too much into the granular, you can see you can trigger it when the loan is first created, when one of the loan status changes, meaning it's moving through its milestones, loan submission, conditional approval, clear to close, that kind of thing. When one of the loan dates changes, a lot of those are the fields that you see in the Audit Dates tab. When the subject property changes, the loan team changes, which can involve both team members being added, changed, or removed from a file. Loan info changes, and that a lot of that has to do with loan program or lender. There's not a lot of options there yet, but that continues to be built out. Loan tracker status changes refers to your third party's order section, or the trackers that you see on Loan Center. So these will be things like appraisal order, title order, HOI. Loan action initiated is the unique one. There's a list of a couple actions that people can take in a loan file that you can also use to trigger these rules. For instance, running AUS or ordering credit. Custom field changes is a newer one as far as the time of this recording. And now you can track when one of the custom fields you've created previously changes or changes to a specific value. Borrower info changes is exactly what it sounds like. And last but not least, task status changes. Now, these are specific to tasks that are created from a task template. Any kind of free-handed task can't be tied to an automation. It has to be a task that is defined and created from a previously existing template. And we'll talk about task templates a little bit later. Below that is rule criteria. So after you pick your initial trigger, you're going to pick some additional criteria that has to be true or correct for this rule to fire. Now, you could just use this initial trigger and never add anything to rule criteria. However, you'll very quickly find that you have very specific scenarios where you want to write a rule, and you'll need this additional criteria. When you click that Add Criteria button, you're going to notice you get a slightly different experience. It adds a new line, and if, and then it's going to ask you to select a field and the properties of that field where this would be true. You press that select button, you're going to notice another modal pops up on your existing modal. And this is going to show you all the fields that are possible to evaluate as part of this automation rule. And at the time of recording, we're doing pretty well so far. It's not every field possible in the file, but we sure get a lot of them. A lot of the information we saw referenced in the initial triggers about property info, borrower info, programs, some very basic pricing and fee stuff that only we're going to get more of later. All of the loan team roles we can reference, and if people are in them or out of them, milestone dates, lock dates, the third-party trackers, business contacts, even additional questions that you have as part of your point of sale. These can be referenced and evaluated as part of this automation, which is great. That being said, there are some quirks to it, but we'll talk a little bit about that and workarounds in another video. But all to be said, you can pick one of these fields. When you hover over it to select, you're going to notice that an additional options pop up on the right side of the field. You can either pick the updated value, meaning the value at the time the rule was run, or the initial value, meaning the value the field had before the rule was triggered. This can be useful when you're writing something where a field changed from one specific value to another, and you only want it to run in that case. That being said, the majority of the time, you're going to pick updated value for this. Experiment kind of at your own risk and with specific test files. Once you add these, you'll notice that there's some additional icons on the right, including a little branching icon. If you hover over it, it'll say nested or conditional. And what you can do is you can use that to trigger additional logic about nesting logic or logic for when you're creating multiple scenarios that if any of them are true, will fire. If this is true or that is true, then do XYZ, that kind of scenario. That's where you're going to start adding those. Next to them, you're going to see a button for duplicate. That just duplicates your existing rule. And that will also duplicate as a OR rule. And those kind of things get nested together as one chunk of logic. There's the trash can next to it where then you can delete that rule criteria. So they make it pretty easy to set up an initial rule and then add other conditions or criteria to it and group it and nest it together. That being said, it's not an easy way to move things around. So if things are slightly out of order, you'll likely find that you have to delete a rule criteria row and then add it back in or add it a different way. I know that they're devoting a lot of time and effort in developing this feature, so this may have changed by the time you watch this video. Once you finally have your trigger set the way you want and all the rule criteria set the way you want, now we're going to talk about the actual actions that you can take place. When you click on that actions dropdown, you're going to see several options. Enforce requirements is one where it's going to ask you that you require certain fields have values or that they confirm something through a special dialog box. Set value of field to something is going to set a value to a specific field. Now, this is pretty restrictive so far. We only have 4 or 5 fields we can set values to, but this list will continue to grow over time. Execute trigger with warning message means that you will let the changes that are happening go through, but you're going to display a yellow warning notification in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and you get to pick the message that gets displayed there. This can be very useful when you're trying to prompt the user to do something or just warn them, hey, you just did XYZ. Kind of the sister action that goes along with that is stop trigger execution with message. What will happen is if you pick stop trigger execution with message, the change they just did that triggered this automation rule will stop and be prevented from finishing, and it will go back to its original value. Along with that, it will display a red notification in the bottom right-hand corner, and you get to specify the text of that notification. This is great when you're trying to enforce certain business practices or rules or certain standards. You can prevent the file from progressing forward or from making certain changes in the file when X, Y, and Z isn't true. Notify someone is an interestingly named action. What it actually does is it sends an email. And this has a lot of the same tooling that you've seen in email templates elsewhere in Arive system. You can use merge tags. It supports HTML. You can reference all sorts of internal loan files and records, and it can even support some special bracket notation and logic if you know how to use it. That being said, this one is a great way to let people know when a certain change has happened, but you don't have an email notification that quite fits the bill. Or maybe if it's kind of a special circumstance and you just need to let someone know that it has met this criteria. It can be used for borrower-facing or external-facing communication, but keep in mind that that notification and messaging and control is buried here in the admin panel, which means if you create automatic notifications, automatic emails that go out to borrowers, loan officers who aren't admins will have no visibility on this except when they see the email has gone out and it shows up in their loan file or in their inbox. Sometimes that is of value if you want to create communication standards that cannot be deviated from. But these kind of actions cannot be controlled from the notification panel, nor can they be adjusted from the user panel. They can only be changed by users with appropriate company-level admin access. Below that is Create Task. Now, you'll have the option to either create tasks from a template where task details are set and the assignee is set usually relative to a position on the loan file. However, you can kind of freehand a task from this section as well. But the situations where that comes into play can be a little bit tricky. When possible, in creating tasks in an automation, it is a best practice to use a task template to create it, because if you want to trigger something from happening after that task was completed, it has to be a template task for that to work. Thankfully, they make it pretty easy in this section to create new task templates right here without having to go back out of the rule. Change loan status is a select action that can only happen when the trigger is that task status changes. What this allows is that you control the movement of files when certain tasks are completed, automatically progressing them or moving them backwards. This can be helpful if you are trying to create a very locked down system where it only progresses when certain tasks are completed. That being said, there are limitations to this, so certainly test thoroughly when setting up rules of this kind and be willing to make changes. This last piece is an especially unique one, the add action criteria. What this does is it almost creates a sub-rule kind of effect inside of it. You can set additional criteria similar to the rules criteria part above for when these specific action or actions will take place. What this allows you to do is write less rules, but build more logic into individual rules and keep your overall rule count lower. Now, these are an advanced feature, and you'll likely find that you at first build many simple rules and later go back and recreate them as fewer, more complicated rules using this action criteria. The other important trick I want to point out about using this action criteria box is it allows you to cause some actions to fire in sequence that normally are not possible. Firing any of the notifications is usually only allows that to be the one and only action taken. Or sometimes sending an email message will only allow you to send it one at a time. This way, you can set up multiple notifications, multiple hard or soft stops, multiple email messaging going out based on if this criteria is true or not true. Now, keep in mind, the rule still runs when the criteria above it is true. But what this section does is determines, will these actions be taken when this other criteria is also true? And these can be somewhat nested together in that multiple action criteria can be set up sequentially, and they will run from the top to the bottom, and in my experience in the system, almost at the exact same time. If you set up multiple notifications to fire from action criteria and all of the action criteria is true, all of those actions will fire. It does not stop at the first action criteria that is true. They are evaluated independent of each other, and all of them can be true, causing all of the actions inside of them to fire. So use carefully. If used correctly, you should not have to write a lot of duplicate logic that does the same thing over and over. It allows for reusable and flexible pieces and for the actions to be taken only to apply when that specific edge case comes in. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you rely on these videos to stay up to date, consider supporting the channel using the link down in the description. See you next time.